Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. You can say good afternoon back if you'd like. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Crescent Besaidnot, and in the absence of our incumbent, Professor Oliver Fuhr, who is currently in Germany, I would like to welcome you all to this fourth annual prestige lecture hosted by the Research Chair for Cities, Law and Environmental Sustainability, or CLES for short, here at the Northwest University. The Prestige Lecture is one of the annual events hosted by CLES, where we invite a recognized expert in the field of urban development and governance to present a public lecture on a theme that slots into the research focus of the chair. However, with the multidisciplinary nature of the urban landscape, it is critical to engage with other scholarly disciplines, and with this in mind, we are fortunate to have Dr. Richard Ballard from the Gauteng City-Region Observatory here with us today. Ms. Viandri Robertson will introduce him a little bit later, but for my side, I would like to thank him and take this opportunity to thank him for coming to Potchefstroom and speaking with us today. I look forward to your lecture and the discussion to follow. I would also like to sincerely thank our Deputy Dean, Prof. Michelle Barnard, for being here and engaging with us today. So just a little bit about the chair. CLES is an academic legal hub for legal scholarship and sustainable urban development in South Africa, the broader African region and beyond. The chair was established in 2018 as part of the SACHI initiative of the National Research Foundation of South Africa, whose funding makes all of this possible. The chair is held by the Northwest University and forms part of the research unit on law, justice and sustainability of the Faculty of Law. Based on its outputs and achievements since its establishment, the chair was renewed by the NRF for another 5 years in 2023. To this end, the chair hosts several full-time postdoctoral fellows and postgraduate students furthering their studies in the intersection of law, governance, urban development, and environmental sustainability. Essentially, that is who we are and what we do at CLES. So today I also have the privilege of being the program coordinator for this event. At this juncture, I would just like to welcome Prof. Michelle Barnard to the podium to say a few words on behalf of the faculty, whereafter I will hand over to Ms. Viandri Robertson to formally introduce our speaker. So without further ado, please put your hands together for Michelle.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I think we should actually put our hands together for you for organizing this event. So yes, please, everyone. Thanks, Kristen. And also just to maybe plug myself and tap myself on the shoulder. Before CLES poached Kristen from me, he was my master's student. He had obviously excellent results for his master's dissertation. He's now a doctoral fellow at the CLES, Kristen. And from my side as well, congratulations with this event. It's going well so far. Early days still, but it's going well. Yes, indeed. Good afternoon to everyone here. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I want to say good afternoon to the organizers of this event. I would like to say good afternoon to colleagues and previous colleagues from this institution as well as other institutions. I would like to say good afternoon to students, invited guests. I would like to say, in particular, a good afternoon to our presenter, Richard. Good afternoon. And also to your colleague, Lebo. Good afternoon and welcome here with us this afternoon. I would like to introduce myself to those who don't know me. I'm Michelle Barnard. I'm the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Law, and on behalf of the Northwest University Faculty of Law, and then more specifically the Executive Dean, Dr. Naya Murray, I warmly welcome you all to the fourth annual Prestige Lecture of the National Research Foundation, South African Research Chair in Cities, Law and Environmental Sustainability. As Kristen said, CLES for short. That's much easier to say. I would like to extend a special word of welcome to our speaker this afternoon, Richard. Welcome to Potchefstroom and to the Northwest University. And you will be addressing us on the multidimensional process of urban spatial transformation in South Africa. Events such as this, the NRF CLES Prestige Lectures, These provide us with critically important platforms to disseminate and discuss contemporary legal issues. I've heard from Richard that it would not have a very firm legal angle, but we're still looking forward to this. And I look forward with the rest of us for another thought-provoking exchange on aspects of the law, aspects of environmental law, aspects of planning, as well as other fields of academic endeavor that also latches on to environmental law. And then, with no further ado, as Kristen has so eloquently said, please let me hand over again to our Master of Ceremony, Viandri. I'm handing over to you, to Viandri Robertson, to introduce the speaker for today. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, esteemed guests and attendees. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today a distinguished expert in the field of urban studies and geography, Dr. Richard Ballard. With a career spanning over 2 decades, Dr. Ballard has been at the forefront of groundbreaking research, delving into the intricacies of urban development and spatial transformation. Since 2015, he has been a valued member of the Gauteng City-Region Observatory, a prestigious research unit jointly affiliated with the University of Johannesburg and the University of the Witwatersrand. Dr. Ballard's journey in academia began long before his tenure at the observatory. He honed his experience while teaching with the Development Studies program at the University of the KwaZulu-Natal. It was here that his passion for understanding the dynamics of urban environments truly flourished. His academic journey culminated in the attainment of a PhD in human geography from the University of Wales, Swansea, in 2002. This formidable achievement laid the groundwork for his subsequent contributions to the field. Dr. Ballard's research is categorized by its depth and breadth, spanning across 3 pivotal areas. First, he has delved into the nuanced processes of city building, illuminating the profound impact these processes have on the spatial transformation of urban landscapes. Second, his exploration of the intricate relationship between identity and place offers invaluable insights into the social fabric of our cities. And finally, his work in urban politics sheds light on the complex dynamics that shape government and decision-making in urban contexts. As a prolific author, Dr. Ballard's publications have left an indelible mark on the academic landscape, enriching scholarly discourse and inspiring future generations of researchers. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Ballard himself as he shares his wealth of knowledge and experience with us. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Richard Ballard.
Professor Michelle Barnard, colleagues at the Saatchi Chair in Cities Law and Environmental Sustainability, Professor Oliver Faux in absentia, Christian Bezuidenhout, Viandri Robertson, Lawrence Erasmus, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much indeed for the opportunity and the invitation to present to you today. I was saying I don't think I've ever given a lecture with the words annual or prestige in the title, so it's a great honor for me. What I really appreciate is the opportunity to be part of conversations between urban scholars working in different disciplines, and that is the great thing for me about urban studies, is we can talk in an interdisciplinary way. I've also really appreciated the opportunity to organize some of my thinking on this theme of spatial transformation. It's a reasonably familiar theme to many of us here, either directly through our research and some aspect of our research, or simply by being a resident in South Africa. We think a lot about these issues as a result of our everyday lives. This is an attempt at a framework paper, essentially, to try and map out the topic. You'll probably spot some things that can help me, and so I'm looking forward to the discussion with that. I'm going to point out that I've put a link on this slide because I'm going to be presenting quite a lot of maps during this presentation. So if you would like to download the slides, you are able to do so now if you go to bit.ly/CLES 2024. And that might be clearer than being able to see from these slide screens, but you'll also be able to see it there as well. So that's bit.ly/CLES 2024. So I should have been more explicit in the title, perhaps, that I am drawing very heavily in this presentation on the case of Gauteng, and that's because of where I'm based at the Gauteng City-Region Observatory. And a lot of what I'm presenting is really work by colleagues of mine. It's really incredible mapping that they're able to do, work with the most amazing data, and I think it tells a really interesting story. So it is a story about Gauteng, and it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on how well it translates elsewhere, or the limits of extending the story elsewhere. Okay. At the level of policy and scholarship, our interest in spatial transformation arises from the sense that there is a relationship between the way our cities are organized and social justice. So here's a simple, sort of fairly classic definition of social justice put forward by the scholar, the geographer David Smith in 1995, when he was writing in a special issue about South African cities. Social justice is about the distribution of society's benefits and burdens. So the implication of that is that a socially unjust society is one in which the benefits and burdens are unequally distributed. A just one is obviously one in which they are fairly distributed. And we all appreciate the way in which apartheid produced structural racialized inequalities, and we appreciate the role of space in reinforcing these inequalities. Until 1991, white minority governments classified people according to race, gave those classified as white many, many benefits. Some of those advantages were specifically spatial. The right to reside in cities, to own homes in cities, to live in well-resourced and well-located neighborhoods. Other benefits were not specifically spatial. The right to have categories of jobs with better incomes than other people, the right to vote, and we can list many other things. But even these non-spatial advantages were spatial in effect because of the way they concentrated on particular people living in particular suburbs and produced social advantage there. So essentially they telescoped privilege onto those classified as white, and the spaces designated for them. At the same time, this produced many burdens to those classified as African, Indian, and colored. Many of these were specifically spatial. Those classified as African didn't have the right to live in cities until the collapse of influx control in the mid-1980s. And they did so supposedly at the convenience of white people and supposedly on a temporary basis. When they did live in cities, they lived in less well-resourced, less well-located neighborhoods. They could not own homes. There was a shortage of housing at particular periods of time. And there were many non-spatial advantages that were manifest spatially. Lower paying jobs, less spent on education, could not vote, so many other things. So given this history, it seems fairly intuitive, or it seems very intuitive to say that the process of transcending apartheid is about moving towards a fairer distribution of benefits and burdens, and that this is going to result or be driven by changes in the way in which we use space. So the premise of urban spatial transformation might be something like this. Since apartheid's injustices were achieved and expressed spatially, we need to arrange and use space differently in a democratic South Africa to support a more just society. So it's a no-brainer. We should live in cities that work for everyone, not just a subset of those who live in them, and that makes a lot of sense. So far that's intuitive, but we as academics are naturally suspicious of any idea that seems straightforward, because these intuitive ideas can sometimes obscure very complex realities. And the main motivation of this paper is to prod around the idea of spatial transformation in order to bring to the surface some of our key assumptions about it, consider the many dimensions of spatial transformation. We use it as if we know what it means, but actually it means quite a lot of different things at once. And to surface some of the paradoxes in the space of spatial transformation. I'm going to start with a sort of one of the things that comes out of this review is that spatial transformation is an idea that does contain many paradoxes. The example I'm giving here is that in 1995, the Gauteng provincial government, yes, that's it. The Gauteng provincial government announced a policy to build a series of major housing projects in the province, which it was calling mega human settlements, or even in some of the policy language, new cities. So these are identified on the map as blue dots. The organization I work for, the Gauteng City-Region Observatory, created this map showing that many of these housing projects were very far away from economic opportunities. And those economic opportunities are illustrated by the red sort of speckles in the middle of the map. And many, not just us, but many people have expressed concern that the housing program in South Africa since the end of apartheid has placed beneficiaries in a situation where they're very, very far from economic opportunities. So it seems a much better approach, perhaps, that we should have urban infill housing, where you build smaller housing projects on smaller parcels of land that are better located. This would create integration within cities. It would make better use of infrastructure, and crucially, it would get people closer to jobs. So I certainly hold this view, and I've thought that at the time. But I remember very clearly a conversation I had with an official from provincial government in 2016 during the Provincial Spatial Development Framework Review, and she said she didn't see it the same way. She said core urban areas were already developed. They already had lots of investment and wealth. And it was important, the responsibility of government to bring investment to poorer areas that were not well developed. And there were large populations of people living there. They needed housing. They needed investment. So it was an important moment for me because there's a discussion that often happens within government that the Department of Housing doesn't quite know what it's doing in its location choices. But actually there's real rationalities behind what is happening, which raise a paradox, which is that spatial transformation is happening along different dimensions, and you might be able to check some boxes, some different kinds of dimensions, even if you can't check others. So let's move to the work named in the title of this presentation. I want to use in the first, the paper is divided into two parts, although in fact the first part's probably going to take most of it. But basically in the first part, I want to map out what I see as 4 different dimensions of spatial transformation. So in other words, 4 different ways in which one could define spatial transformation. What does spatial transformation look like? What kinds of urban changes and urban outcomes have been regarded as broadly desirable, and why? How does that relate to social justice? So I'm going to look at each one in turn, say a little bit about it, and then think a little bit critically about how they relate, how it might relate or have limits with the project of social justice. Turning to the first one, perhaps the most intuitive one would seem the most direct rebuttal to the project of apartheid would be the process of racial desegregation in our cities. Apartheid claimed that people of different races could not live in the same neighborhoods. So different people of different racial categories living in the same neighborhood would be evidence of South Africa transcending a history of racial intolerance. And we might anticipate, too, that shared lives means that people develop common sociality across historical divides, and so therefore there's a scope of some kind to build social cohesion that was never possible under apartheid. It also means, a slightly different point, that white people no longer have a monopoly on well-located and advantageous parts of urban living environments. So racial desegregation seems like a very clear and obvious dimension of spatial transformation, and would stand as evidence of greater friendliness, fairness within our cities. There's been a great deal of debate in the literature about whether or not we've seen meaningful or adequate racial transformation. Some scholars have done the usual measurements of these things and said that large portions of people still live in racially homogeneous suburbs, And the result is a broad distribution that has very many parallels with apartheid. So the map on the left here comes out of a text from 1991, Parnell and Perry. It's a map of Johannesburg's group areas, essentially. So you can see the northern suburbs and some of the southern suburbs that were allocated for white occupation. You can see Soweto, African. You can see El Dorado Park, colored. You can see Lenasia, Indian. And you can see the other group areas that were marked out. If you look across to the right, you will see what is known as a dot map. So it's based on census data from 2011. Unfortunately, we don't have this level of granularity yet. For the later census, we're looking forward to it maybe later this year, and we'll do a similar kind of map. But essentially, each dot represents 200 people. And each blue dot is 200 African people. Each green dot is 200 colored. Am I getting this right? Each sort of orange dot is Indian, and each purple dot is white, 200 white. So you can see there quite a lot of resonance between the two maps. Certainly, Soweto still looks like Soweto. Lenasia and El Dorado Park just jump straight out. It's very, very clear. You can also see that the northern suburbs are where white people are living in Johannesburg. So that aspect has not changed. But if you zoom in, you do see actually a huge amount of change, which we all appreciate and understand, which is that those suburbs formerly allocated to white people have become desegregated. Not only that, inner cities, places like downtown Johannesburg, have transformed completely. These were spaces that were once allocated to white people are now very, very different. So it's not entirely correct to say that, as sometimes gets said, there hasn't been change. This is what the change is looking like. So the process of that transformation really followed, as we know, the grey areas before the end of apartheid, the collapse of the Group Areas Act in 1991, inner city transitions, and racial desegregation of former white Indian colored suburbs. Many people today are living in places that they would not have been allowed to live under apartheid by virtue of their racial classification. And we can't underestimate how profound that is. But as a form of transformation, it has a series of limitations. The first is clearly this is not a form of spatial transformation that is available to everyone. It's only available to those who have higher incomes. And so what we're seeing here is that racial desegregation is not incompatible with class segregation. So we still have cities that are highly divided by income. And so you can have integrated spaces that are integrated racially, but actually you have rich over there and rich living over there and poor living elsewhere. The sociologist Owen Crankshaw has written a really important book, 2022, on urban inequality in Johannesburg. And he shows how the transformation of Johannesburg's economy over the last 50 years has really left blue-collar workers stranded with unemployment and very low incomes. And so essentially what you're seeing is the inability of large numbers of a majority of the population to have a lot of choice about where they live. So this rather busy map that you're looking at has a pie chart for every single ward in Johannesburg. And it's sliced up according to the value of property in each of those wards. So if you're seeing quite a lot of red, it means there's a lot of properties in that ward that are over 1.2 million. If you're seeing a lot of blue, it means there's a lot of properties ranging between 300,000 and 600,000. So you can see how profoundly the property market is segregated in Johannesburg and what that means for choices about where people can live. Another series of busy slides, but we'll talk through them. So in this figure on the left, we can see basically an interaction between race and income. So the bars on the left of the bar chart are lower income earners, and the bars on the right of the bar chart are higher income earners. And we've used the same colors across the map and the graph. So, for example, the bar on the extreme left, is 9% of Johannesburg's population. It's those households earning less than 800 Rand a month, so it's the super poor. 96% of this group are African. It's very similar with the next graph, with the next column. This is 31% of Joburg's households earning between 800 and 3,200 a month. 93% of this group are African. So a huge overrepresentation of Africans in lower income brackets, and an overrepresentation of white people in higher income brackets. So you can look between the graph and the map, and you can see that the 2 or 3 sort of higher income groups, which are these ones, are represented here. So all of these people can afford to live in the spaces that were once reserved for white people. Everyone else doesn't have that kind of choice. They just don't have the finances. So that's something we all appreciate, but it starts to raise sort of some thoughts about what the possibilities are for racial desegregation in our cities. Another interesting thing to think about just briefly is that integration is one-directional in terms of space. So you have processes in which former white suburbs have desegregated. What does that mean? There's been quite a lot of interesting research by social psychologists, by geographers, who showed the very difficult interactions that actually happened with it. It's not that everyone was neighbors and then suddenly became friends. That did happen. There were dynamics that looked a bit like that. But there were also other dynamics in which white people attempted to set the terms of assimilation, essentially, or there were forms of resegregation that happened at a very local scale. This really amazing book by Mark Hunter is on schooling in Durban, and he is talking about how integrated schools, even though they completely racially integrated, still managed to retain a white tone, and that's something that everyone buys into, because that raises the status for everyone who's going to that school. Really interesting thoughts about what does racial integration actually look like at a suburban level. Another sort of limitation we can point to is that if you find a ward where there's a good balance of people, where there's a good mix of white and black, and you look at the average household incomes of those two groups, this is work done by a colleague, Christian Hammann, and the graph on the right is basically a series of wards in Johannesburg where there is a good mix. It shows that in most cases, black African households are earning less than white households. So when you see sort of racial integration, there's a story behind the story. And I think, as well, I would say, the fixation on apartheid's racial categories is one in which we don't recognize the cosmopolitanism of black spaces. So often where this discussion leads is we go, oh, well, the townships are not integrated, or the inner city is not integrated. But in fact, these are some of the most cosmopolitan spaces in our cities. And I'm going to illustrate that with these two maps. The map on the left is a map of racial diversity. So the darker the color, the more mixed a ward is. The map on the right is a map of language diversity. So the darker the ward, the more language is spoken by households in that ward. So according to the map on the left, Soweto is not very diverse. But if you look at the map on the right, it's extremely diverse. According to the map on the left, Bryanston is the pinnacle of integration in Johannesburg. But on the right, actually, there's very few languages spoken there. So I think there's something a bit limiting about using apartheid's racial categories for understanding what it means to live in mixed spaces. Okay, so that's the first dimension. I think it gets us thinking about what spatial transformation actually looks like. What has happened is completely profound, as I've said. But as it relates to the project of social justice, there might be other dimensions we can look at. And so one of the ideas that might surface here is whether or not social justice can be improved if we integrate people, we bring people into closer proximity across wealth differentials. So people who are high income earners, onto thinking beyond urban racial desegregation as the spatial transformation. To what extent can putting people of differential incomes or wealth close together take us forward? There's been a huge amount of growth in Gauteng, obviously over the last 30 years. The population of Gauteng has more than doubled since democracy. And you can also see in this map how the urban land cover has grown. So this map does it by, the gray area was urbanized by 1990. The yellow area is the bit that was urbanized between 1990 and 2000. The green area was that was urbanized by 2010, and then the red area is most recently urbanized. So this is land that is going from being not urban to being built up. And in the 90s, that was happening at 30 square kilometers a year. It slowed down a little bit after that. It was still quite high, at least 22 square kilometers a year. It's important to understand this because the way in which Johannesburg has grown spatially has brought people of different incomes into close proximity. So one of the ways in which this happens is through human settlements, housing programs that are reasonably close to middle-class suburbia and in the path of expanding middle-class suburbia. An example of this is Cosmo City in the northwest of the city of Johannesburg. And you can see how it is quite close to expanding middle-class suburbia in a way that Soweto is not, for example. Another interesting example is Fleurhof, which is a housing project in the mining buffer zone. So this was the zone that was meant to separate the races. They're starting to put housing within it. So it's possible that some housing projects are creating a mix of incomes and also therefore race. Also informal settlements or informal occupations near to affluent areas can do some of this kind of integration as well, in a sense. Kaya Sands, Sunspruit, Ivory Park, these are all informal settlements that are in the north of Johannesburg. Some are quite close, some are right up against the wall of a gated community, for example. And so you're getting a different kind of proximity that wasn't there 30 years ago plus. I want to use the example of Diepsloot and Steyn City. Steyn City is a really enormous gated community, 3 kilometers south of Diepsloot, an informal settlement. So that's Diepsloot, and there's an aerial view of Diepsloot and Steyn City. So Diepsloot is a little bit further to the north, and Steyn City is here under development. You can probably see it says the club at Steyn City, very close. And if you zoom in, you see that famous image of Steyn's house. So not all the houses look like that, but they're certainly very wealthy and a lot more wealthy than those in Diepsloot. So they were saying, this is great. The development is at the door of Diepsloot. That's the very thing we get criticized for, opulence next door to poverty, but that's exactly where development should be to empower people to get jobs. So they don't have to spend half their salary on transport. So this is the developer talking about Steyn, saying, let's applaud the wealthy man who comes to South Africa to build on the doorstep of Diepsloot, and let's vilify the wealthy man who runs away. Who's going to make a difference to the people? I would kiss Bill Gates' feet if he came and built a house in Diepsloot. It would create a lot of jobs. It's a funny thing to say, but anyway, that's what he said. So this comes out in the literature, the urban scholarship as well, basically saying when gated communities are located in poor neighborhoods, this is potentially a good thing. It gives opportunities to poor people that otherwise might not have been there. Okay. Other ways in which this might be happening, other than informal settlements, is homelessness and occupation within informal areas. So, there's often a thing that gets said that the northern suburbs of Johannesburg are only affluent and then everyone else is everywhere else. Increasingly, that's not the case. There's a huge amount of occupation of space by shack dwellers living along rivers, homeless people living within suburbia. I think it's something we don't understand well enough, but it's certainly changing the kind of proximities that we were used to. And then those are all processes that are happening beyond policy. There are also some very interesting policies that are starting to shape this. And so the really important one is inclusionary housing. Inclusionary housing is a policy through which planning departments within municipalities oblige developers of gated communities or of other complexes to include a percentage of affordable housing within their development. So you don't just get to build a Stain City with 10,000 units for very high-end individuals. You've got to include perhaps 30% accommodation that is meant to be affordable. It's something that's only really started to show itself fairly recently. Johannesburg was the first city to adopt it in 2019, so already some permissions to develop have been granted on the basis of this, so it's going to start making a difference. But that is a way of thinking about how the state can transform the relationship between rich and poor within suburban spaces. What can we say about integration between people of different incomes? So the first thing that we can say is that, in fact, it's mostly not happening. Most working class settlements remain at a very far remove from middle class settlements. So Lufereng is a formal government housing program just to the west of Soweto. In fact, when the developers, when the provincial officials were talking about it, they're saying it's a natural extension of Soweto outwards. And then there's this series of newer informal settlements around Orange Farm to the south. You see all those red areas because they have grown a lot in the last decade. It's incredibly far from Johannesburg. I was aware of a security guard working in Ilovo who lived in Orange Farm. There's no ways he could get home on a Saturday night when his shift finished at 5 and back to start work the next morning on Sunday morning. There just simply wasn't any transport. He would sleep on the floor of his security hut. So these are the kinds of distances that are really actually quite often playing out between rich and poor. It's important to remember that apartheid planners wanted a certain kind of effect in the way that they rearrange cities. So on the left is the way segregation was happening until apartheid came along. And then on the right is how apartheid reorganized segregation. And really the intention of the way the apartheid city was to work is so that groups could grow indefinitely outwards without ever having to leapfrog over one another. And so what's happening with a place like Lufereng is exactly what was intended decades and decades ago, even though that's no longer the kind of driving logic. So I've put a few sort of arrows showing how townships are extending outwards in the fashion that was intended by those apartheid planners. So that's one limit, is actually there's not a lot of mixing between rich and poor. There's some of it, it's certainly happening in some forms, but very often the distances are enormous. Even when there is close proximity, you've got to sort of think a little bit critically about what that exactly does for the poor. So Stain City was crowing about the fact that they'd created 11,000 jobs and this would be good for the people of Cosmo City and of Diepsloot. We did a study to see exactly what people were earning, and it was incredibly low. It was 2,500 Rand a month. This was in 2016, so you can inflate that a little bit. But people were telling us, you know, after 2 years of work, I can't afford to buy myself a pair of trousers. So simply having rich and poor literally sort of 3 kilometers apart, there might be important benefits to the poor. It doesn't resolve everything. You might still be able to be quite poor and that not change just because of your proximity to the rich. So there's the second dimension, possible dimension of spatial transformation. Some things are happening that are really, really interesting, not inconsequential. There's a limit to, you know, how much we can actually achieve integration at that level. I'm kind of amazed that it took so long for inclusionary housing policies to come on stream. They should have come on stream 2 decades ago. A lot of the city has been built in a way that is incredibly exclusive. So what then can we say next? Another form, and quite different form of spatial transformation, is to say, well, we're not going to be able to mix everyone in the city. We're not going to have rainbow neighborhoods where you're going to have a happy mix of all those categories. We really need to recognize that we've inherited the city that we've inherited, and what is crucial is to bring more and more advantages to those spaces that are disadvantaged. And I think we all appreciate the extent to which investment has happened in townships or in new spaces like integrated human settlements, or even in informal settlements of various kinds. So there's been a huge amount of investment in working class spaces, both by the state and also by the working class themselves. So this is information from the census showing that 97.9% of Gauteng residents, households are connected to piped water. It's an incredibly high level of service provision at an infrastructural level. We know about that the provision of housing has been an enormous undertaking. According to the 30-year review that was put out a week or two ago, South Africa has provided 5 million housing opportunities across the country. It's kind of unparalleled around the world what has happened in relation to housing provision. So there's a map showing where housing provision is happening in Johannesburg on the right. Those green shaded areas are housing projects that are happening across Johannesburg. An enormous amount of effort going into providing housing. As we said earlier, the spatiality of it comes to the fore. You can see a lot of it around Soweto, for example, or even as far as Orange Farm. But there it is. It's a huge effort. Another way in which talk about uplifting townships has come out is around things like township economies, or even human settlements policy. So when the Gauteng government announced this human settlements program, where they were going to build all these new cities, they said they're going to be self-contained. People are going to be able to get jobs there because we're going to set up industrial areas within all of these new settlements. So there's this idea that it might be possible to localize economy within human settlements or bring more economy into townships around Gauteng. In practice, what that has tended to mean is that government expenditure is directed through service providers based in townships. So it's not the creation of new economy, it's essentially a redistribution of existing economic opportunity. And there's also, I'm sure you've seen all the headlines, a great deal made about job creation schemes of various kinds to get jobs to people who are unemployed. So the three ways in which working class spaces have been invested in, and you could extend that list a lot more. Thinking a little bit about the limits of this as a form of spatial transformation, certainly you would have thought it already. The breakdown of services is really racing away from us. This is a map by some colleagues showing the percentage of respondents per ward reporting water interruptions every week or at least a couple of times a month. So you can see some areas are almost solid because those areas are experiencing a huge amount of water disruptions. And you could do a similar kind of map across other kinds of services. We're certainly all affected by electricity. So that's the first point, is there's a breakdown of services. Everyone might have a pipe to their house, they might not be getting water. Collapse of housing delivery. This is actually an example taken from eThekwini. A friend of mine at Glen Robbins has calculated this. It's not always easy to see what's happening to housing numbers. But you can see in here that in 2008, the high point was almost 18,000 houses were built in eThekwini. In the last few years, it's been more like just less than 2,000. And that's a story that's repeated across the country, the collapse of the provision of housing by the state. So this investment in working class spaces was going a lot better than it is going right now. A specific point around the idea of township economies used language that was incredibly hostile to foreigners. It was basically saying that anyone who has a spaza shop and is not South African should have it taken away from them. That was in the first version that was in the bill. It wasn't passed, But the sentiment still kicks around. It gets expressed by the Premier, and it gets expressed by others. So the township economies idea seems to be a kind of zero-sum game where there's a finite economy and it's going to be shuffled to the right people. And of course, incredible enduring unemployment in townships. This is a map showing the density of unemployment in Gauteng, the number of unemployed people per square kilometer. And in those dark blue areas, it goes up sort of between 5,000 and 8,000 people per square kilometer who are unemployed, all concentrated in townships. And we certainly all appreciate that situation. So there's some very real limits to this enterprise of investing in working class spaces as a form of spatial transformation. It's a huge amount of money has gone in that direction, huge amount of effort, and certainly much has been achieved. But as a process, it runs up against some very real limits. The fourth dimension of spatial transformation, and this is the final dimension before I go on to the second part of the presentation, is to think about the scale in which cities are governed and in which we all belong together within one city. So what happened with the transition to apartheid during the 1990s was a redrawing of city boundaries around the principle of creating uni-cities out of what had been highly fragmented tax bases, a whole lot of different cities in effect, different municipalities, brought together into one municipality so that it would be possible to have, as the slogan went, one city, one tax base. It's possible to redistribute within the fiscus of a city's budget. So that's profound. That's a really important spatial transformation that happened. And in fact, the idea gets kicked around still. So there's quite a strong lobby to say that entities that are currently district municipalities should become metropolitan municipalities because increasing the scale of governance is necessarily more transformative. So that's something that gets said quite a bit. But it's very important to understand that people in Johannesburg were once sort of living in different cities, are now living in one city. So they might be segregated. They're segregated by race, by class, but they are in fact all residents of one city and paying into one fiscus and benefiting from one political process. So changing the scale of governance, but also thinking of the way in which any individual living within a city such as Johannesburg can make use of the whole city. So they might be confined to a particular area that has many disadvantages, but the point of living in a big city is that one can get out to other parts of the city, find jobs there, and possibly benefit from the city as a whole rather than be confined to the space that reproduces disadvantages. So this is a table that shows the contrast of nighttime populations and daytime populations, first of all for a series of townships and informal settlements, and then at the bottom for a series of business hubs. And you can see how places like Diepsloot lose something like 29% of their population every morning as people flow out and they go elsewhere to work or do whatever else they do. And so you can see the way in which people are moving around this. This is a city of movement and flow. And so that's another way of thinking about changing the scale at which we're imagining the city to function. A really interesting way in which this has played out is the way in which suburban schools have become quite open, quite mixed, quite integrated, and people from places like townships are able to get kids into suburban schools. So this map shows that those dots that are colored red shows the percentage of people who are traveling for more than 5 kilometers into that school. And you can see that in townships, it's a very low percentage. Most people are traveling locally to the township school. In suburban schools, people are traveling from far and wide. And so there was even this idea within Gauteng provincial government that maybe we should change the catchment zone. Maybe we should just make these catchment zones bigger, because then you're opening up schools and you're making things fairer. So that's another way of thinking about spatial transformation as this kind of city-wide set of relationships that allows people to benefit from living in a large city. Crucially is transport. Huge amount of money has been invested in new schemes. You're aware of the Ria Vaya scheme. You're also aware of the Gautrain. Lots of money. It's the most subsidized form of transport in South Africa is the Gautrain. So a lot has been put in because I think the state understands the importance of being able to connect everyone. If you are living in a segregated part of the city, at least you're able to get out and move around. So how do we understand the limits of this form of spatial transformation? The first point is that some of the biggest projects, the Gautrain, the Ria Vaya, only carry a tiny fraction of commuters within Gauteng. There's no integration of the transport system. There's no integration of ticketing. Old modes of transport are unsafe and in some cases shrinking. So here's a really incredible map there's a graph that comes out of GroundUp that shows how ridership on metro rail trains went from something like 600 million in 2009 to almost certainly nothing in the COVID year, but barely recovered since. So it gives us a real sense of how PRASA has transformed and is no longer moving people around city regions in the way that it once did. We can also reflect critically on the way in which gated communities have locked up certain parts of cities. We can say that everyone is now free to move around Johannesburg, but all of those red shades are gated communities in Johannesburg, and you can see how much of Johannesburg has been re-enclosed and is functionally not available to anyone to walk into unless they happen to be working there. That might be the case. And a last really important limit to this is the way in which this arrangement is hampering economic growth in general. So this is a report that came out late last year, Growth Through Inclusion in South Africa, basically saying the reason why South Africa's economy is not growing is because it is so spread out and segregated. And people have to spend so much money commuting that has to get priced in somewhere. Either it's priced in by the employer who's having to pay workers, or it's a burden for the worker. It's a real direct handbrake on the economy. And it certainly also hampers the ability to even make public transport projects work. You know, if you want to have something like a Ria Vaya, you need a certain level of urban density so that there's enough demand along the way for it to justify itself, and it's not there. This is a really powerful piece of analysis done by a couple of colleagues. And I'm going to have to talk you through both the graph on the left and the map on the right. They relate to one another. The graph on the left shows 4 different kinds of wards. The dark green ward, the line at the top, is a ward that was above average income in 2001 at the census, and increased in 2011 to such a degree that it moved away from the provincial average. So the provincial average is the black line. The light green line is a ward that was above average in 2001. It increased, but it increased more slowly than the provincial average. So effectively, it's converging on the provincial average. That orange tan colored line was a ward that started off below average income, and converged on the provincial average. And then that red line was a ward that was poor in 2001 and stayed poor in 2011, and it moved away from the provincial average. So those are 4 example wards. Those similar wards are mapped out on the map on the right. And basically what that's showing you is that any dark green area is an area that was already rich and got even richer to a point where it moved away from the rest of the province. And any of those red wards was a ward that was already poor and got even poorer. It got further away from the provincial average. And so you don't have what you would expect from having a city, a region that is integrated, that everyone's starting to benefit from it, that there's some kind of convergence happening, where there's some kind of equalization over time. And you can see that in townships, a lot of those wards are red. They're very poor, and they're not converging on the provincial average. Okay, so I've gotten to the end of the first part of the presentation. And as I've said, I think the second part will be more like a third. I think it's important to sort of go through this. One can ask the question, are there other dimensions that I'm not mentioning? Can you split some out? Maybe this is a limited list in some ways. But you're asking the question, what does spatial transformation really look like? It could look like any of these four things or some combination of them. Something might check the box of one kind of transformation, but not another. Each of these delivers some gains. You can see some good, some benefits from each of these things. But each clearly has a whole lot of limits, which means it can't be generalized out. And in some ways, what we sometimes think of as being good is worth thinking about a little bit more critically. So the way I'm going to sort of go from here is to think about how we talk about spatial transformation. And really all I'm doing here is surfacing the claims we make about spatial transformation and hoping to think a little bit critically about them. So the first one, claim A. In the democratic era, our cities should or will be better than those we inherited from apartheid. You see this in policy documents. So the one I always go to, I'm sorry this is going to be over 2 slides, so it's quite a lot of reading, is straight out of the National Development Plan, published 12 years ago in 2012. It says, by 2050, South Africa will no longer have poverty traps in rural areas and urban townships, workers isolated on the periphery of cities, inner cities controlled by slumlords and crime, sterile suburbs with homes surrounded by high walls and electric fences, households spending 30% or more of their time, energy, and money on daily commuting, decaying infrastructure with power blackouts, undrinkable water, potholes, blocked sewers, violent protests, gridlocked roads and unreliable public transport, new public housing in barren urban landscapes, new private investment creating exclusive enclaves for the rich, fearful immigrant communities living in confined spaces, or rural communities dying as local production collapses. And then it goes on. It says, instead, the country will have productive farms, well-managed villages, towns, and cities, tolerance, democracy, fairness, and respect for the natural environment, citizen-centered services, secure water and food supplies, diverse and cleaner energy supplies, more walking and cycling, security barriers coming down in the suburbs as people reclaim their streets, a mix of housing types and tenures to meet the different needs, energy-efficient homes, fewer private cars on the road, and decent public transport, public spaces where people from different social groups mix, well-maintained infrastructure supporting dynamic businesses and vibrant economies. So that's all on the horizon of 2050. We're going to have all that. And then by 2030, we're going to have developments that will break away from old patterns, and significant progress will be made in retrofitting old suburbs. Interesting to read that 12 years after it was published. What can we say about these paragraphs? They're very normative, very clear about what is undesirable. They're very clear about what is desirable. And very often these two things are the inverse of one another. We're not going to have, if cars are bad, we're going to have more people walking. So they're kind of on a seesaw with one another. It identifies a direction of change over time. We're going to have a lot more of what is desirable. We're not going to have the stuff we don't want. It produces an idealized, you might even say utopian vision of what a better city will look like. And it follows this kind of genre of goal-setting language where it says, this is what we're going to have. the country will have, developments will have. So obviously the confidence of such statements is intended to motivate the right kind of action from state and society to move towards this goal. But that's one of the kinds of claims that's out there about spatial transformation. We're going to live in better cities. And you see it quite often in policy documents. A second idea that is around and is well recognized and is now very clear, I think, from all of the previous presentation, is that spatial configurations have social consequences. So if we have people living in segregated spaces where you got some people living in rich neighborhoods, others living in poor, that's going to help reproduce inequality within society. So in the UK, they talk about postcode lottery. It's a lottery as to where you end up living or where you're born, but it's going to have huge implications for the quality of your life chances, because services are different in different places. In the US, there's been research on what they call the neighborhood effect. The neighborhood you live in really shapes the kind of person you can become because of the kind of job that you're going to be able to get. And I think we can see a lot of research in South Africa that has made similar kinds of arguments. So that's the second claim about spatial transformation, that space really does matter for society. And from there, we get a jump to this idea that we can fix our broken society by fixing our fractured cities. It's an idea that I think is really profoundly articulated in the Corridors of Freedom project in Johannesburg. In some ways, this is the high watermark of this kind of thinking. What it said is we're going to take these BRT routes that we're putting through our cities along the left, and we're going to create corridors, quite wide zones on either side of those, where we're going to densify, and we're going to create a mix of housing that is going to bring a different mix of people in. So the documentation at the time was saying things like, we're going to restitch our city to create a different future for our residents, where we can link jobs to people and people to jobs. Or even more directly, rich and poor, black and white, living side by side. The principle of that is that there's a lot of demand to live along a popular route like a BRT route, and you can draw people in to do that. So it's an interesting example because we haven't seen so much of this. It excited a lot of people because politicians and city authorities haven't really gone there as much as this particular project tried to. It's no longer around in that form, which is something we can talk about, but I table it as an example of how this thinking can work. A fourth claim, urban transformation is at best only partly the result of our goals, plans, and policies. So this is a kind of sober acknowledgement that cities are not working for people, we should have better cities, cities are consequential, we should rearrange our space. But essentially, a lot of the scholarship and a lot of the policy work recognizes that it's very, very difficult to reshape cities. A fantastic text on this that some of you might be familiar with is Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space, where he basically says, yeah, sure, you get people who are architects and who are planners, and they are coming up with plans and visions and designs, and they're implementing some of them. But really, that's not what makes a city by itself. It's helping to make a city, but it's just one of three components. Really, what is driving the process of making a city is spatial practice, which is how the hundreds of thousands or millions of people living in a city actually use space and build space for themselves. So that's often not done with reference to the National Development Plan. It's not done with reference to any of the grand visions that we can say, yes, that's the kind of city we would like to live in. It's being done by quite different logics. And then cities are also built by the meaning that individuals give to the space that they inhabit. So that's his idea, is actually, it's wrong to say cities are a projection of a vision or a plan. Rather, you might say, we secrete cities around ourselves a bit like a snail secreting a shell. That's his metaphor. So no one's really thinking about it. These cities grow around us because of the way in which we use space. So some of the language about spatial transformation sometimes doesn't recognize that very extensively. Just the incredible sort of numbers of buildings that were built between 2001 and 2016. This is the growth of residential buildings in Gauteng from something like 2.1 million to 3.4 million. A huge amount is happening out there, and very little of it is being directed by grand visions. A lot of it is freehold formal houses. The dark green is informal housing structures in informal settlements, so that's the growth from 395,000 to almost 600,000 shacks in informal settlements. There's massive growth of backyard dwellings from 266,000 to 813. That's not approved by planners. No planner wants that. They're starting to have to catch up with the urban reality, and some progressive planners are trying to plan for it. But this is an example of society building cities of its own accord. So this is a list, which I'm not going to read out, but really of the range of actors who are shaping urban space, all according to different logics. And yeah, the city is being built by the people who live in it. Another claim that gets made very often is we don't have spatial transformation. It hasn't happened. So you can see these are just 3 examples, and I sort of have a bunch more that I could have thrown in. South African cities are among the most unequal and visibly divided in the world. The inequitable form of urban settlements has been reproduced rather than reshaped. True spatial integration has not occurred, resulting in a policy failure. Or even in the Housing White Paper, which was published in November last year, the human settlement pattern in South Africa continues to reflect the spatial legacy of the apartheid era. This is despite fundamental changes to the spatial planning and policy framework and associated implementation tools since 1994. So a real kind of despairing idea around spatial transformation, going from where we started off saying we're going to live in better cities, a lot of people saying it's not happening in any way that is really adequate or sufficient. We know where we should be getting to. We know what all the desirable outcomes are, but in fact we've been diverted onto a track we're not choosing and wouldn't choose, and is not consistent with the society and the ideology of the society in which we have. And it goes back to that Lefebvrean point, which is that we don't choose cities off menus. We don't choose urban outcomes off menus. These things emerge as a result of the economy and the society in which we inhabit. So you can actually reverse the earlier causal relationship that I put up, saying how does space shape society? The reverse is also valid, which is that society continues to shape space. We saw that in the limitations that I put up earlier about how people are restricted in terms of where they can live. So the way in which society and economy is working is shaping how space is used. And so this is the kind of tricky part of urban spatial transformation, how you break these vicious cycles in which inequality is reproduced. Okay. And the final thought, I feel like I've got a Jenga stack going on and I keep adding more things on. Sorry, I'm going to add one more and see if it collapses. Is that sometimes our aspirations for spatial transformation cause us to exacerbate the burdens of vulnerable people. So this is really just a sort of footnote, and not something I'm developing extensively here. I mentioned the xenophobia around township economies. We can add to that attempts to move informal traders out, Operation Clean Sweep. There was an attempt to bring in legislation in KZN in 2007 that would have eradicated informal settlements in the province, supposedly. It would have criminalized anyone who had informal settlements on their land, and it was overturned at the Constitutional Court. The recent fire in Johannesburg at the end of August last year, everyone's reaction was, we shouldn't have hijacked buildings. So there's a way in which our idealized visions of how cities should be can actually cause us to to do harm to those who are most vulnerable in our society. 2 more slides. I think what all of this raises for me is the question, can we fix society by changing cities? We can start off by recognizing that spatial configurations have really, really important effects. The way in which space is organized does have implications for people's life chances. The fact that people have to get very far from where they live to jobs places a huge burden on them, on the economy in general. Fortification and sort of withdrawing of the wealthy is having huge implications as well. That's the case. The state does have some agency to intervene. The state can do a lot. Inclusionary housing only came on stream in 2019. It should have come online 2 decades before. It's incredible that it didn't. There's discussions we can have about better locations for housing, regulations for densification rather than sprawl, transport planning. There's much that can be done by getting governance right and by getting governance of cities right. But we can also recognize that spatial configurations grow out of the economies within which they're rooted, out of the societies within which they are rooted. Economic restructuring in Gauteng has left blue-collar workers stranded. And it's very difficult to plan a different city with these levels of inequality. It's very difficult to say, we don't have spatial transformation without resolving those fundamental issues. And what that also suggests is that some non-spatial interventions are very important. We think that spatial transformation is about, corridors of freedom or something like that. It could be about keeping the lights on, to keep the economy as robust as we can possibly make it. Tackling unemployment, thinking about labor protection, thinking about welfare, thinking seriously about how we do reduce inequality. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was a very thought-provoking discussion. So this brings us to the next part of our program, the question and answer session. There is a roaming mic with one of my colleagues, with you. Where is Tato? Okay, Tato is over there. So we're going to start the question and answer session. I see we already have one hand up, another hand. So we can start with Mishka. Can we take like a round of questions and then we'll circle back and I'll come.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Richard, for that interesting and insightful presentation. I was wondering while I was looking at these maps and things, do they take into consideration the hijacked buildings or abandoned buildings in which people actually live? Because in these buildings, people live there and they're a little bit closer to the services, the work environments and things that they need. So instead of trying to build a new policy and trying to locate spaces where people can be closer to their works and things, wouldn't it be more prudent or wise to utilize those spaces that people already live in, take back control and revamp them so that they're more livable, and then to sort of locate new places? Because then in this case, there is more spatial integration. And once they're also a lot more governable, people would want to be in those spaces. Because people tend to avoid them because there's less control, policing, visual law enforcement, and things like that. So that's just my question. Yeah.
Thank you for that. It's quite a mouthful. I hope you got all of that, Richard. Okay, you can go, Loretta.
Dr. Richard, I'm testing the waters for a potential 5th dimension. Sustainability has 3 components: people, planet, and profit. So I think if looking at your presentation, you can say, I can say integration will tick the people box and economic growth will tick the profit box. But what's going to tick the planet box? So I guess my question is there any space for environmental concerns or the protection of the environment in this transformation agenda? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Ballard. I have a concern about the water situation in Gauteng. We often read that Gauteng is going to run dry. Where does that fit into the spatial planning?
Okay, so can we hand over to you to answer, and then we'll take another round of questions.
Thanks very much for kicking off the discussion. I think the points are great. So, Mishka, the hijacked building story is incredibly difficult, but a lot of work has been done on it. You know, there's an amazing policy in place called the Inner City Housing Implementation Plan that was approved actually under Herman Mashaba's tenure. It was started under his predecessor, Parks Tau. And it has a very clear plan for how one might do exactly what you're saying, which is to identify processes that would allow buildings to be refurbished. The big difficulty is that it would be very difficult for people who are currently living in these buildings to be able to afford the rental of a refurbished building. And so part of the plan allows for some kind of subsidization or alternative accommodation. It's an interesting and well worked out plan and worth having a look at, in part because it's receiving so little attention right now. It seems like the only response to the fire last year was all of these have got to go. And so the players in the sector haven't kind of grappled with the fact that they're not allowed to summarily evict people from these spaces, that they have to make alternative accommodation arrangements. They haven't catered for that alternative accommodation. There might be something sort of in the region of 90,000 people living in such conditions, and they've built just a few thousand temporary residential accommodations. And so a lot of concerted effort needs to happen, but it can only happen if the basic principle is the one you mapped out, which is that people are in a place they need to be in. And very often that's not the starting point of people who are speaking in the space. Lawrence, I think your point is great. You know, my colleagues do a great deal of work on these questions of sustainability. I think what you're provoking me to do is to think about how, I mean, one can think about the work I haven't done in this presentation is to sort of get a bit closer to what characterized the apartheid city. And what you're pointing towards is a fundamentally kind of unsustainable urban model environmentally. And so it was a Fordist kind of approach to how one builds a city, car-based, big industry, incredible commuting distances. Certainly when cities write their integrated development plans, they speak a lot about the importance of sustainability as a key driver for why there has to be spatial integration. So that is certainly something that the planners think about a lot. Prof. Pino, the water situation in Gauteng is fragile, and again, I have colleagues who work on this question. There was a discussion, there's been a discussion ever since what has happened in Cape Town as to whether Johannesburg could be confronting at some point a day zero. There is clearly the huge issue around water provision within cities, not only the sort of original supply, whether or not there's a drought, but a huge amount of leakage within cities. And so we're clearly behind on refurbishing water lines, water supply lines to a terrible degree. we're about to finish, all of this data comes out of a big survey that we do every 2 to 3 years called the Quality of Life Survey. And so we came out of field last month after having been in field for 6 months, and we'll be able to see, I think, quite a deterioration around service provision in general, and I suspect water as well. We haven't looked at the numbers. We haven't got the data yet. It's a huge worry because part of the definition of being in a city is that one collectively consumes these things. We collectively consume electricity, we collectively consume education, healthcare, water provision, refuse removal. These are things we club together as a city to organize. So we do that through our rates and taxes. And we really do depend on municipalities who are able to govern those processes with the revenues that they derive. The process of more and more people opting out, if they're able to afford to do so, kicks in a different part of the vicious circle, which is that rates that were going to local government are no longer going to local government. And so, yeah, it is a huge worry. I share your worry.
Okay, thank you for those rounds. Will we have another round of questions? Anyone? Show of hands. Don't be shy. Okay, we have 2 questions there. Fredouard. I'm not sure if who the other hand that was up. Yes, of course, of course you may.
Doctor, I think I would like to add to what my fellow clinician was asking, Dr. Erasmus, because he made mention of issues of environmental sustainability, as he alluded that we have social sustainability, economic sustainability, and environmental sustainability. Don't you think when it comes to the issue of energy transition, has Johannesburg been able to achieve energy transition, that is from fossil fuel to renewable energy? And when it comes to issues of rooftop agriculture and all those things, are you able to facilitate those stuff into your integrated plans? Thank you very much.
I think I saw another hand. Was it? Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ballard. My question is regarding smart cities, the nexus between smart cities and spatial transformation. Because while we're talking of smart cities now, and it's a good idea, I'm just wondering now with your presentation how that relates to spatial planning, to spatial transformation, sorry, and if that accommodates the whole idea of smart cities accommodating more of the rich than the poor, will that not further widen the gap between the rich and the poor if we're talking about smart cities and how they relate to this whole idea of spatial transformation? Thank you.
Fantastic. And then we have a question up front as well.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. Yes, I have a question related to finance and to credit access, actually. There was a slide related to the income brackets, and there's a large portion that relates to the missing middle, people that are just rich enough to not be poor and just poor enough to not be rich. And then with reference to inclusionary housing, how do these, or that specific group, and even those poorer than the missing middle, do you have any information on access to credit for these people to actually gain access to housing?
Thanks again for these questions. Energy and transitions in Johannesburg and rooftop agriculture. I think the situation is as you see it. We're behind the curve. There's much discussion, but some of it seems not to amount to a plan that reassures any of us very much. So I've sat in meetings with government officials who will say things like, we think we should turn to the use of gas more than we are at the moment. So not recognizing that gas is not a renewable resource, and that in fact we don't have a plan as a country to have gas beyond 2026. So we seem to be casting around a little bit in the dark. Other cities seem to be pioneering a lot more, and I'm sure people in Johannesburg are taking a lot of note, and a lot of plans are being put in place. I don't have the inside story. From the outside, it looks like the coalition government has stalled a lot of processes that might have been able to sort of fast track that kind of thing. The BRT system that I put a couple of photos up got cancelled by Herman Mashaba. So when I leave the Gautrain station each morning, I walk past a fenced-off BRT bus station that has been fenced off for years and years and years because Herman Mashaba just canned the whole thing. So even that BRT process that I think they should have followed through on, in fact, had a whole lot of investment already on the go on, is just suspended because there's no agreement about getting that back on track or not. Rooftop agriculture, I don't have a lot of experience with. I had a PhD student in Durban who was pioneering a lot of these possibilities. It's certainly there as a technology, but my sense of it that in South Africa the nature of our cities is so sprawling that rooftops are not really at a premium. Most people live in spaces where they're living not in spaces where there are viable rooftops you could grow anything on. There might not be a lot of ground or land that they could use for agriculture, but it'd be very difficult to do rooftop in a space like Diepsloot, for example. So it's an interesting question. I assume this might be your area of work, so it'd be interesting to talk a little about it. The question of smart cities, I think you raise an interesting possibilities that some of if we're talking about social justice, the distribution of benefits and burdens it could mean that people living in places like gated communities are able to benefit a lot more from these kinds of technologies, from the smartness of urban management. You're right. I think there's a real question. I didn't get enough of a sense from your question where you think that might be going, but that's my thought on it, that you're right, it could result in certain kinds of new injustices. The interesting question is what are the possibilities for fairer distributions of benefits and burdens as a result of smart technologies or smart cities in general? And that's not something I have a clear answer on right now, but I think the whole promise of smart cities is that there can be quite democratic gains as a result of those. Even if we sort of thinking in terms of the functioning of a city depends on effective collection of rates and taxes. Tshwane has made some big claims in the last few weeks about doing a lot better on that score. So even the bread and butter stuff of how a city needs to function, send out bills and collect money from people, is a kind of in the domain of how a big city needs to function using technology. If it can start to get those kinds of bread and butter things right using technology, we all gain a great deal from that. Finance and credit access, really interesting research done by Sean Butcher in Johannesburg on the affordable housing market and how categories of people who were previously considered unbankable or not unbankable but unmortgageable by the banks were discovered by the banks, have been given mortgages. So I don't know what the current, when we were driving out here, we were sort of commenting on the cosmopolitan development that's happening very far out of Johannesburg. I don't know if we were yet in Northwest, but it's very, very far out. But that's the kind of development that is happening and that is able to access credit for basically starter homes, often at something like R500,000. I don't know what the current rates are, but very low. There are mechanisms such as FLISP, finance-linked subsidies, where people would get partial subsidies to buy homes through state financing. So they're trying to move away from only providing RDP houses to also partially subsidizing. Very important. It's a crucial question. Yeah.
Fantastic. Do we have any other burning questions? Show of hands, anyone? Okay, then I will use my powers as the master of ceremonies to pose a question as well. And I think we can, with this question, move into your final thoughts on what you'd like to say. So my question relates to one of the slides that were up in terms of the National Development Plan. So the first slide was very I'm not sure how to say the utopian, I'll use the word that you used, this utopian perspective of how these spaces, how cities should look. And the first one was how it should not look, and the second one is how it should look. Do you think there would be a possibility of us within that time frame, 2050, which is, it's not that far off if you think about other international development makers such as the SDGs, that's 2030. 2030 is around the corner. So where do you think we are going, or where do you think we should be headed? That's something that can take us perhaps into your final thoughts. Whereafter, oh, do you have a question? Sorry? Yes, please, please. Okay, so yes, please. Feel free to elaborate. Okay, no, oh, someone pass the mic. Thank you very much. I see our mic runner has disappeared. Okay, so please continue.
Thanks for the presentation. I was just looking at the title and listening to what you're saying. Very interesting, and I think I'm leaving here with more questions about what actually does count as spatial transformation. But I think it's another dimension, just latching on what you're saying, is perhaps, you know, the way in which our cities are changing, and specifically looking at technology and the impact it's having in industries. And that perhaps in the future we might find ourselves not necessarily needing to travel to places anymore to get things done. So the way in which businesses are going to be conducted in the future. And I wonder what impact that will have and how a city grows. So I guess leading on from what you're saying is, what role would technology have in spatial transformation and how we measure it, but also the role of secondary cities, because, you know, specifically what you're speaking to here is urban transformation. And a lot of these small towns or rural towns are beginning to see budding economies, you know, and people perhaps preferring that way of life. And we were chatting earlier on about people moving to the Karoo, for instance, to go work there and live there, and life is going on as usual. So thanks to technology and the way in which the world is connected, we can work anywhere, we can do things, you know, there's remote locations for most industries. So I'm curious to know how that will shape spatial transformation, at least in the South African context. Yeah, if we're just now gazing into the future. Thanks.
I'll allow you to answer those, and then you can come up. Huh? Fantastic.
Something I should have said on sustainability is that quite a lot of the work that our colleagues have done has shown that poorer people are more vulnerable. I'm sure this is something that comes out very front and square in your work here as well. So this is something that is, we ask questions in our survey about whether people have been exposed to floods or fires or other kinds of environmental conditions. And overwhelmingly, people living in informal settlements or in townships are much more exposed to these things. Fires, it's about 4% of people in Johannesburg say, yes, we were exposed to a fire in the last year, or we had one near us. We don't exactly know what that looks like. It could have been a veld fire next door, whatever, but there was a fire in their lives. That goes up to 10% of people living in informal settlements. And you can see similar kinds of vulnerability bumps that happen with water, with floods, and we can go back to water availability, water outages. All of those kinds of things really hammer the poor. And I think you're right, there is an easy way of closing the loop around the story about spatial transformation as a social justice question and environmental sustainability. where are we going by 2050? I mean, I think it's an interesting genre of writing because it does open up the imagination. I think in reading those words, one can become, I think, very frustrated at the missed opportunities. I think there's a lot that could have been done and can be done right now that we're not doing. Can we reach that utopian point? Really what that is going to take is not just spatial interventions, but a very different looking society. And if we continue with the economic structure that we have, we're not going to get there. But that then raises the very big question as to what exactly those kinds of changes would look like. So, you know, you can reverse the question and say, what would it take to see those kinds of outcomes? What kinds of agency do we as a society have? Does government have? Do authorities have to do these things? Do people on the ground have themselves? So they, you know, when I've put up those quotes before, people sort of got a bit defensive, saying, "Aren't we supposed to be aspirational?" Yeah, that's what it's like to be aspirational. The words are there, but 12 years on, it starts to think, "Wow, we really, you know, the urban environments unfolding around us don't look like those words." Yeah. Technology and travel, a really interesting question, and you probably have more thoughts on it than I do, but as you know from the recent census that got released, Gauteng has, I think, 1 million fewer people than they were expecting us to have, according to the latest census. Whether that was the result of 30% undercount, which did happen in the census, or whether it's the result of semigration, people shifting to the Western Cape, or people emigrating or moving elsewhere, not just affluent people. Colleagues are looking at how large numbers of people relate to spaces in Limpopo and in Mpumalanga, which have become heavily urbanized. People are taking their wages that they're getting in Johannesburg and investing them in houses in places like Bushbuck Ridge. Almost 500,000 people living in Bushbuck Ridge in a more or less urban, suburban environment. So it's not just about, you know, professionals living in, I don't know where, in the Karoo and zooming into all of their meetings. It's everyone who is developing quite different relationships with what we would think of as the hinterland, but is actually an extended version of Joburg. I don't know if I'm missing something. Oh, closing. Those are the closing points. Thanks very much for choosing to spend your afternoon here. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm just going to invite Dr. Erasmus up to do the closing for us, and then you'll take it from there. So thank you very much from my side, everyone, for availing yourselves and attending today's session. I think it was very interesting. It did open a lot of questions in terms of what we need to be looking at, what our research should be striving towards. So thank you.
I think as lawyers, we typically look at the laws, how to interpret the law, analyze the law, and also how to apply the law. But then we also need context. We need to understand the societal problems and issues that those laws actually try to regulate. And that's what makes a lecture like today especially valuable. Dr. Richard, thank you very much. I believe I speak on behalf of everyone when I say this has really been insightful and helpful. From a personal point of view, you've really made me think a lot. So thank you. Then I also want to say thank you for making the effort to actually prepare this lecture and to travel all the way from Johannesburg and to spend the day with us. We really do appreciate it, and we have a small token of appreciation that I'd like to hand to you. Oh, sorry. Thanks again, Dr. Richard. Okay, this brings us to the end of our fourth Prestige lecture. I want to thank every one of you that attended today. We really appreciate it. Also thank you to the videographer team. We'll be streaming this lecture on YouTube. So please join our social media channels where you can rewatch it and rewatch it if you want to. Also, thank you to the organizing team, Kristan, Tato, in Essentia. I think today was a great success, so well done. You did a great job. And now that Dr. Richard has given us a lot of food for our thoughts, it's time to get some food for our tummies as well. So please join us. We have a reception here outside. You can just follow me, exit this door and downstairs, and then we'll have the reception. Thank you very much, everyone.